So moving away from some of that leadership as force.
Totally.
Right? You know, which is kind of a stereotypical sort of male ideology of what leadership looks like. And it is older than 20 years. I refer to it as the pale, stale male sort of theory. And when we think about who created institutions like the university, they were created and dominated by white males. And through that lens, it informs the students of today. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. How do we understand women leaders through the lens of reading about male leadership? How do we find Indigenous women's leadership by reading about pale, stale males?
We don't. No, we don't. And that's why 7th generation thinking. Welcome to The Scaries, brought to you by Racer Co. I'm Sky.
And I'm Talitha. We are proudly broadcasting from Treaty 4 territory here in Regina. And in each episode, we tackle the alarming, inconceivable, questionable, shocking, and scary statistics relating to, intervening with, and impacting the lives of women and girls worldwide.
You'll hear the scary truths, take away tools and tips, and learn about what you can do about it. And the Scaries is an opportunity to use our voices as women and supporters of women to make some real change. As always, opinions expressed on this podcast are solely our own, so please listen with caution or take it with a grain of salt. And also realize that we may be sharing some statistics or some facts that could be triggering, so also just consider that as well.
As straight, cisgender, white, able-bodied settler women, we are aware of the privilege that we have, and we want to use this podcast and this platform to spread awareness about the scary reality that women from around the world face in different life situations.
Why?
Because sometimes nothing is scarier than being a woman.
Hey.
Hi.
Today we're exploring the significance of matriarchs in Indigenous communities.
Ooh.
And we're so excited to have our friend, advisor, mentor joining us today for a discussion about her Ph.D. research, work, and lived experiences. But before we get into that, we've been on our own individual journeys with truth and reconciliation and have brought these learnings and lessons into our work at Racer Co. But of course, we're in the work of progress. I would never claim to be the experts on this matter at all. So please just keep that in mind as we go through this. We're learning as we are chatting and you're learning with us. So we've definitely grown and shifted over the last 5 years that we've been in existence as Racer Co. And we're super eager to just grow and learn more in so many aspects of life and leadership. So covering episodes like this one today is one of our commitments as well to learning and growth. I'm in an area that we definitely, like I said, are not experts in. And we hope that you can take some knowledge away as well and use it as a way to impact your own reconciliation journey.
Absolutely. And as always, we want to start with defining a few things. So to set the stage, we are on Treaty 4 territory, as we always say, but which actually exists on Turtle Island. So in North America, you'll often hear those countries' land masses, so like US, Canada, Mexico, being referred to as Turtle Island. Have you ever heard that term before, Sky?
Oh, yes, just a couple times.
One or two.
Yeah, but others might not have, so we should get into it.
Always. So Turtle Island is a name used by various Indigenous peoples of North America. It originates from several Indigenous creation stories that describe the continent as being formed on the back of a great turtle. So beautiful. The term is deeply rooted in Indigenous cosmology and spiritual beliefs. For many Indigenous cultures, the turtle symbolizes creation, longevity, and wisdom. And the idea of Turtle Island highlights the sacred relationship between Indigenous peoples and the land, emphasizing their stewardship and interconnectedness with the natural world. Okay, and this is also actually very random, but have you seen the Disney movie Strange World?
No, it's new, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I have
good.
not seen it.
Okay, so if you haven't seen it, and sorry, you haven't seen it, but I'm going to ruin this for you. But if you haven't seen it, skip ahead like 30 seconds because I'm about to have a big spoiler. But I was absolutely obsessed with how the movie showed the impact of colonialism and this like capitalist, focused, driven way of like wanting more, needing more, sucking the earth dry, that kind of thing. But in the end, you actually find out that they are living on the back of a giant turtle.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's so cool. Like they do it's the whole thing. They're looking for like power or whatever, but they go in and then they like come out the other side and they're looking in the eye of this great turtle. And then they realize that they're living on the back of this huge living thing.
Wow.
Yeah. It's really,
Love
really
that.
beautiful.
I'll have
but
to watch
I think
it.
Like I was like, there's some Indigenous understanding and ways of knowing and being in here. Yeah.
So cool. Okay, well, here's another definition for you. And this is really around the root of what we're getting into in this episode. And that is matriarchs. So matriarchs are the wise leaders of Indigenous communities, and they play a pivotal role in shaping the cultural landscape of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis culture on Turtle Island. In many Indigenous communities, women are seen really as the heart and soul. They still are, and women in general. It's heart and soul.
So, we are everywhere.
Yeah. So the term matriarchy refers to a society where women hold the majority of positions of leadership or decision making. Fancy that. They're the ones who give life, and they take care of everyone. They speak up for their kids, their grandkids, and future generations. They speak for also the land, the water. They carry the languages. They hold valuable knowledge and lead important ceremonies.
So important. And I also read that the matriarchal systems not only welcome women in leadership roles, but they are rooted in the deeper concept that women are direct reflections of the climate, the land, and the waters. And I'm like, I feel so powerful in this. That's why the earth is commonly referred to within Indigenous cultures. And I think that's like seeped into kind of everyday culture, but as mother. So Mother Earth, based on her infinite abilities to provide life and longevity, which is a reciprocal process between humans and creatures and the environment as a whole. Spirituality really lies at the heart of Indigenous cultures, and matriarchs serve as spiritual leaders. Their deep connection to the land, ancestral spirits, and traditional teachings guide their communities in ceremonial rituals, healing practices, and sacred ceremonies. Through their stewardship, matriarchs instill a profound sense of belonging and interconnectedness among their people, fostering spiritual resilience in the face of adversity.
Very cool. And totally right. And really, because of the importance and just the revered role that women hold and held Indigenous cultures, men and women were historically always equal in their unique power and strength. So they had very different power and strengths, or they were viewed as different, but both equal and equally respected. And their roles were equally important, which we don't see every day.
No.
And they each had autonomy within their personal lives. So they each had their roles and they stuck to those lanes. They didn't try to mix into it, which I mean, pros and cons there, but that had a sense of respect for each other. Equal respect.
Respect for holding those spaces of like, which I think in Western, I want to say like quote unquote worlds is like not as respected, right? And not seen as
all and all, the power for everyone. There wasn't that. In fact, women were never considered inferior in an Indigenous society until Europeans arrived.
Of course.
So at the time of first contact with Indigenous people, women had few rights in European society. Men were considered their social, legal, and political masters. And any rights women had were those derived from their husbands. The law of England, for example, held that women did not have the right to vote, to own property, or to enter into contracts at all. This attitude was ultimately reflected in the Indian Act, which blatantly discriminated against Indigenous people and women specifically.
Perfect. Yeah.
So they had this attitude toward women that continued until relatively recent in Canada, sadly. Women had to fight battles in the century to win the right to vote, which wasn't until I think 1960, which is nuts.
Indigenous women.
And to be recognized as legal persons. What? And it was only within the past few decades that the final legal restrictions upon their right to contract and own property were lifted. What? Like insane, mind-boggling. Colonialism cast a long shadow over Indigenous lands, disrupting traditional governance systems and eroding the authority of matriarchs. Systems like residential schools and the Indian Act aim to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Eurocentric norms, leading to the loss of cultural identity and intergenerational trauma that we all hear too much about. Not too much, but we hear a lot about it. And
too often. It's so impacted.
Yet despite these adversities, matriarchs remain beacons of hope, navigating the complexities of modern society while preserving their cultural heritage.
Yeah. Absolutely. So important. And thinking about all of those systems, I think that we're even still really just uncovering and learning about in our own ways and like our own reconciliation work and our own truth work. But there are so many inspiring and impactful practices that we can learn from Indigenous matriarchs and leaders and cultures as a whole. And we're going to get into what those things are in a second. But first, let's set the stage for the main distinctions and differences between matriarchy and patriarchy. I know that we always like condemn patriarchy.
Like, what is the patriarchy? And I mean, we're not going to dive. This is about the matriarchy, so let's keep it about the matriarchy. But there's an important difference.
There is an important difference. And I think that it's understanding that it's a system and not men at a whole.
It is. That's a good point. It's
Yeah.
not just men.
No.
It's a systematic result of a bunch of things that just have given men power.
Yeah. That have, benefited, I think, the men, but it's a lot of people feed into it. You can feed into it in different ways. So the biggest difference, aside from the obvious gender power imbalances within patriarchy and matriarchy, is that patriarchy is seen as vertical. So it operates in a system of hierarchy. You think about kings and queens and then dukes and then like peasants and then slaves, that sort of thing. Whereas matriarchy is more horizontal and circular and is not about putting women at the top. Rather, it emphasizes reciprocity in relationships over exploitation.
That's so cool. I love the visual it just gives,
feels warm
right?
and fuzzy.
Well, and just you think like patriarchy, you think of a line. It has a beginning and an end. There's only few at the top, only few people benefit.
Yeah.
There's definitely a power imbalance, right? But matriarchy being that circle, it's connected, it's equal, it never ends.
Continuous,
It's continuous. It just makes so much more sense when we apply that idea, especially when you compare it to the idea of our definition of leadership.
Exactly.
And what that looks like.
Yeah.
And the patriarchal definition of leadership that we still see too often today. And I would say the matriarchal definition that we're trying to bring into the idea of leadership. So
great
really
point.
cool.
Yeah. I guess we've always like talked about it in that way, but we've never made it as like it is matriarchal approach.
Yeah,
but it is
very cool.
Wow, things you learn.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, it's our own thoughts, and I'm like, well, we're women, so it makes sense.
It makes sense. So then let's chat about what Indigenous leadership looks like, specifically from the role of matriarchs and what we can learn from them and apply to our own leadership. So as we share some of the hallmark characteristics of Indigenous matriarchal leadership, it's important to keep in mind that it obviously varies greatly across different cultures and communities. But these are some of the kind of the common, more overall, overarching characteristics that are often prominent. So first, it's that Indigenous matriarchal leadership often emphasizes consensus building and collective decision-making processes. Decisions are typically made through consultation and collaboration within the community, with a focus on inclusivity and hearing all voices.
Beautiful.
Sounds absolutely incredible. If only everyone would take that approach. The second is that matriarchal leadership tends to prioritize a holistic approach to leadership, encompassing not only the political and economic aspects, but also spiritual and cultural and environmental dimensions. This approach often reflects a deep connection to the land and a commitment to sustainability.
I just want to know, I love that when you think about leadership, we think about how you can be a leader and what that role looks like beyond work.
Yeah.
You're taking into account the whole human, their spirit, their physical, their culture and everything to do with it. And so I love that this matriarchal leadership fosters that.
Absolutely.
It doesn't just be like, okay, how can I help you be the best employee?
Yeah.
But no, how can I help you be the best human?
Yeah.
By looking and caring and digging into all those areas of a human. So
and
very
it
cool.
removes that thing of like, leave your feelings at the door, leave your family,
and your everything. Yeah.
Like you're not just a number. All of your lived experiences contribute to what you bring to a workplace and a community and all of that.
And then how the environment impacts humans and how humans impact it and how we need each other to really survive. So how can we be healthier and better in both ways? So really interesting.
And that interconnection just actually brings me to the next one, which is that matriarchal leadership often emphasizes the interconnectedness of all living beings and the importance of maintaining balance and harmony within communities and the natural world. This perspective often informs decision-making processes and relationships within the community and the environment. Thinking about the environmental aspects of it too.
If I've ever seen anything more like ESG or DEI or CSR, it's this. It's like considering all social, environmental, all the pieces of, the world and how they all play a role in bettering and, they're all interconnected.
Yeah.
Like it's very just so intentional and so makes so much sense. We rarely see them all connected to each other. They're always like, hey, how can we do something for the environment? How can we do something for like society?
So siloed. Yeah. My mom had mentioned in the last, I can't remember if it was mentorship or leadership episode with the moms, but that the UN, I think, was talking about having a she approach to like the world, and it's sane, humane, and ecological.
Ecological, yes.
Yeah, and it like talks about, or maybe it was environmental. Anyways, but it talks about like
ecological.
Like the environmental aspect. So like that we think about that whole approach and utilize all of that.
Matriarchal leadership is already ingrained in probably so much of what we learn, Mother Earth and things like that, but we don't even know it. It doesn't get the recognition that it should.
Here's part of the recognition.
Yes.
So the fourth is that matriarchal leadership places a strong emphasis on relationships and community well-being. Leaders prioritize the health and welfare of the community as a whole, fostering solidarity, cooperation, and mutual support among community members.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about, oh, I feel good, I'm winning. It's like everybody. You lead from that servant leadership, I guess.
Right,
It's like
exactly.
not necessarily behind, beside.
Yeah.
Second last is that matriarchal leadership often plays a crucial role in preserving and revitalizing Indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. Leaders work to ensure the continuity of cultural practices and knowledge across generations, fostering resilience in the face of external pressures and challenges. So again, I mean, it's not that it's women doing this, it's that the matriarchal approach we see is that fostering and maintaining of like
their
history.
identity and their history and their culture, and weaving that into everything, because I feel like there's so much you can learn from it. It's such a strong part of their identity.
Absolutely.
And it should be.
So last is that matriarchal leadership recognizes and respects the diversity of experiences, perspectives, and identities within Indigenous communities. Leaders strive to create inclusive spaces where all community members, regardless of age, gender, or background, feel valued and important and empowered. And I think that we even see this with the history of a land acknowledgement and like why land acknowledgements are done. And it's that like when communities were meeting each other, they would acknowledge that they're on their other person's land, and that it's just a point of respect,
right, and recognition and thank you and appreciation, right?
Exactly, absolutely.
Which probably not enough people know.
No,
when
absolutely.
we think about our
They don't know the
land
history.
acknowledgements.
Yeah. So overall, Indigenous matriarchal leadership is characterized by this deep commitment to community, well-being, cultural continuity, and collective empowerment, with women playing central roles in shaping and guiding the life of the community.
So interesting. And so many of the traits or the characteristics that you shared are very representative of our guest who's going to be on with us soon, Lori. And I know we've both heard her speak on a number of occasions, and we've been in meetings with her and all kinds of things and events. And she is very memorable and she has so much to say. And what I love is her and so many other Indigenous leaders, their use of storytelling and inspiring others and teaching in just their whole leadership approach. And so it got us thinking a little bit more about the significance of storytelling to Indigenous leadership and that approach. And we discovered that it plays a very critical role and strategic as well for several reasons. So let me share a couple of those with you. So the first, and this kind of ties in with what Talitha said, is the preservation of cultural identity. So when they share those stories, it helps them preserve and transmit their cultural identity, their theories, their histories, and it brings those stories from one generation to the next, which is super important for, again, making sure future generations understand, support, recognize, and continue on the same stories. And it also reinforces the interconnectedness of individuals within their community, their ancestors. It goes far back into their spirituality as well. So
exactly,
So that's one reason. It's also involved in just teaching and learning. Oftentimes in most stories, if it's a good story, it's got a moral, it's got a teaching in it, right?
Yeah.
So they use it to relate, to educate, to bring things into a simpler concept for people to understand and then obviously comprehend a little bit better. And really a lot of, in terms specifically matriarchal leadership, a lot of their stories are all about lessons on ethics and morality and resilience. So again, those inspire. It's a lot more inspiring to hear a story about what I went through or what, our culture went through versus just like, let me just tell you about resilience. And this is why you should do it, right?
It's also, that's like that memorable part of it. Like you don't forget it. You're
and
like,
it hits your emotions differently, right? And you don't forget it because it hits you in an emotional way versus a, cognitive way.
Yeah.
So another item, another trademark of storytelling is that it bonds and unites the community. So really those stories bring people together by shared experiences that you might have. Oh, I went through that too, or I can relate to that. It fosters empathy, understanding, solidarity, and really promotes like social cohesion and overall well-being.
Yeah.
It also empowers and provides representation. So Indigenous matriarchal leadership often amplifies women's voices specifically through storytelling. So it's the women telling the stories and the stories are about women. So they're represented in these stories, which is great, as having a key role, not just the supporting role or the background role. They're they're the leads in these stories, which is so great to see. And oftentimes that helps to promote gender equality and empowerment and inclusivity within the community when you can see yourself, hear about yourself, or people like you in those stories and how they overcome it. You think you can do it too, or you're more inspired that you can. And lastly, the last hallmark of storytelling is just the inspiration and resilience that it provides. So it creates a sense of pride in their cultural heritage and belief in the ability to overcome obstacles collectively, and especially in Indigenous cultures where they've still have so many adversities and so much trauma. Stories are even more important to remind them that they can do this, that there is hope, and they can continue to fight on. So
I love that. That's a really great coverage. Thank you for that. I think stories are, I know, in Indigenous cultures used so prominently in teaching and everything, as you said. And not that I didn't think about this in terms of other speakers, but when I do hear someone speak and they tell a story, not maybe in an Indigenous context, but in any kind of context, you hear someone on a TED Talk or you hear whatever, and they tell a story, and if it's a personal story or if it's something that actually paints the picture, it just sticks so much better in your brain, which 100%. Makes so much sense. Great way to lead. Yeah. So anyways, I cannot wait for Lori to enlighten us with all of her stories. I just love listening to her, as you said. But before we get into the main event, I want to give you all a really quick prelude into what her primary area of research and interest is surrounding Indigenous women in leadership. We'll just provide a little bit of extra context in terms of what we're talking about. So through her vast experience in education, she has observed in the last decade and a half or so that how indigenization, also known as Indigenous engagement, has become a popular trend in Canadian universities. The release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action in 2015 accelerated efforts to quote-unquote indigenize. To address this trend, most Canadian universities have created senior Indigenous-focused administrative positions. So many report directly to the president or the provost, and their responsibilities cover university-wide mandates. So it's not just one specific thing. It's kind of all over the university, all encompassing student engagement, policies, all that sort of thing. Of particular interest for her study is that Indigenous women have taken up a significant number of those positions. University ideologies that focus on meritocracy, individualism, and competition do not coincide with Indigenous worldviews, as we've learned, and can create conflict for Indigenous people who hold formal leadership roles in universities. So 3 things that she discovered were: 1, most of these senior executive positions have been taken up by Indigenous women. 2, most of the research to date about the experiences of people in these roles has been focused on the challenges they face, so looking at the negatives. And 3, research on Indigenous leadership has predominantly been about Indigenous men in political positions or Indigenous women as grassroots organizers. So that's all I'm going to give you for now, as we want Lori to really drill down into her research that she has so far, to share how she found this out, what impact it's currently having, and what needs to be done to change things in the future. So with that, let's get to the main event. Welcome, Lori Campbell.
Welcome.
Hello.
We're so excited to have you. Let me tell you a little bit about Lori. Lori Campbell is a Two-Spirit member of Montreal Lake Cree Nation, has dedicated her career to promoting social justice and equity in education. Currently pursuing a Ph.D. in social justice education at the University of Toronto, she focuses on Indigenous women's leadership in higher education. With over 16 years of experience in student services and administration, Lori has received numerous awards for her commitment to service and leadership, including the Women of Inspiration Indigenous Leader Award and the National Inspire Award for Leadership in Education. Huge deals.
Amazing.
Through her work, Lori shares her personal and professional experiences to promote Indigenous voices and advance social justice in education and communities. Welcome again.
Welcome.
Hello again.
So, Lori, we have a couple rapid fire questions. We do this with all our guests just to get you kind of loose and warmed up. So let us hit you with them. So we just have 3. So the first one is, what's the last fun book that you read?
Okay, so I hadn't read a fun book for probably 5 or 6 years until just recently. I'm just going to check here. I just got this brand new book called Through Hiking Will Break Your Heart by Carrot Quinn, and it's her story about hiking the Pacific Crest Trail.
Wow.
And I'm loving it, and I'm so enjoying reading something for fun again. And that was a gift from the amazing Clara Hughes, who I think thought that I needed to tend to my mental health and take a break.
Yes.
That's really good advice.
For sure.
Everyone needs that.
Yeah. So next one, who do you look up to the most?
I'm so lucky to have so many mentors and people in my life from all different walks of life, and some, younger than me, some older than me. But I would say ultimately the person that I probably look up to the most is my auntie, Lori Campbell. The work that she's done, and the more spaces and places I go, everybody knows her, and I continue to hear all the amazing things that she's done. And I have a lot to learn yet from her.
Oh, amazing.
Awesome. I love it when it's someone in your family.
Yeah.
It's just like, so close.
The moms.
Perfect.
The aunts.
Okay, last but not least, what is your scary?
I think my scary is probably, when I think about in Indigenous culture, we think about 7 generations thinking. And I think one of the biggest issues today is that people don't care enough to think past when they're going to be here. And so, when we think about 7 generations thinking, it's supposed to be that we're making decisions that will situate, 7 generations from us in the best way possible. And we're just so individual right now. We're thinking about ourselves, maybe our kids, maybe our grandkids, but not really, and it's really, you really have to try and center yourself and come from a selfless space to think about those that are going to come after you, but you will not meet them. And sometimes when I think about that, I think about, I'm the 7th generation from Chief Mistawasas, who was an original signatory to Treaty 6 territory.
Oh, wow.
And so I don't know him. He doesn't know me. But he was making decisions that were going to affect me at this time. And a big one in that is the medicine chest, which is what they held out on so that we have access to healthcare in this day, not even understanding at the time what that was or what that would look like or what we would need.
I love that 7 generations of, and we've heard that before in other conversations we've had.
I think I hear it so often in terms of the intergenerational trauma. So it takes 7 generations to heal from that. But I've never actually put it in perspective of like, there's still 7 generations to come after me. So what am I doing right now that I can impact for the good people who are going to have to live in this world, and especially in terms of the environment and all of those wonderful things.
Being very intentional with everything you do.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to get into the nitty gritty questions. So could you tell us a bit about your research on Indigenous women in senior administrative roles at Canadian universities?
Yeah, so I'm just waiting for my ethics approval so I can actually, fully get underway on it. What I'm looking at is Indigenous women's leadership style. In the university, we know what a lot of the issues are in the kind of work that we do in senior administrative leadership roles that are sort of centered around Indigenous engagement, Indigenization, decolonization, that sort of thing. We know so many of the issues, and there's not a lot written really about Indigenous women's leadership as a strengths-based, standalone, like what are we bringing? And so I'm curious about that because, I know I have in my family, I know Indigenous women leaders. And so I'm curious about that and how that might inform like a 20-year-old me, but also inspire a 51-year-old me. And and again, those that will come after, but also how it might help our colleagues work with us and alongside us, understanding better what it is that we're bringing to the table.
Right. And the change that you're making in those spaces. Something that I found really interesting in your kind of breakdown, the 3 things that you've learned so far, is that there is some literature about these women in these spaces, but it's more negative focused. It's maybe about the challenges that they faced. And so my question to you is, why is it significant that Indigenous women predominantly hold these positions? And why are we celebrating it?
I don't know. It just happened that I noticed that it was women in these positions predominantly. Now, we're a few years later, and we just actually had our national meeting just this morning, and there are a few more men in there, but it's still significantly dominated by women. But women were definitely the first sort of through the door and to take on these roles. And so I think there has to be some significance in there. Now, I don't want to jump ahead and decide what my research is going to tell, but I think, we've heard stories about, Indigenous women as leaders and Indigenous women taking, that next step and healing families. And we know that Indigenous women are enrolling as students at a higher rate than Indigenous men. Actually, all women are enrolling in university at a higher rate than men. And so I'm curious about that. And, I suspect obviously, that this is part of what's occurred because of that, but it's hard to step into a leadership role in a mainstream organization. Yeah. So what is it that they're bringing? And myself included, I haven't really analyzed that, and I'm part of the one of the participants in the research. So, because I work in that area, and so that will be interesting as well.
I love that you get to study yourself in the process and like
Oh, right.
understand how you move through the world in terms of all of this that's going on.
We often look at leadership as like male or female, right? We look at specifically female leadership, but no one really digs into the intersectionality of that. So how different religions, how different cultures, how all of those things impact your values, and then how you lead. So, can you tell us a bit about what are the specific traits and characteristics of Indigenous women's leadership style, and how do they differ from the conventional leadership paradigms?
So again, my research will tell me more about that. But so some of the things that I looked at in the background, there's work published on Indigenous women as leaders, like in grassroots sort of movements. So you think of Idle No More, blockades that have occurred, Oka, those sorts of things, and the women warriors that were there. And then there's literature written on Indigenous men in leadership, and it's usually in like politics. There is a little bit on Indigenous women in politics, but not so much. And so I also found this like imbalance, right? It's like women as grassroots leaders and men as political and more mainstream leaders. And yet when you look at like what I said in the university, it's like, well, the women are up here at like the highest leadership positions, executive roles as well. And so that's really what I wanted to like look at and kind of shed some light on, and noticing that Indigenous leadership, Indigenous women's leadership in particular, is not defined by or through the lens of white scholarly leadership, right? And so because we were leaders before colonization. And so that's also been another piece of how I'm doing my research.
Yeah, I think so often we look at leadership from like, leadership was only defined like 20 years ago, and that's what we're basing it on. But no, the ideas and the ideologies of leadership is ingrained into so many cultures, and it's different than what that kind of 20-year-old definition is. I think it's older than 20 years.
Well,
but
and let's be honest, we're trying to change the definition of leadership all the time, from that status symbol and those certain like aggressive male, stereotypical male characteristics to something else, and more set of behaviors that lift others up.
Yeah. So moving away from some of that leadership as force.
Totally.
Right.
You know, which is kind of a stereotypical sort of male ideology of what leadership looks like. And it is older than 20 years. I refer to it as the pale, stale male sort of theory. And when we think about who created institutions like the university, they were created and dominated by white males. And so who wrote the work that we study today? It was men, and generally white men, because others weren't allowed into the institution. And then that still permeates, where we are today. You still study the genealogy of those original scholars, and through that lens, it informs the students of today. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. How do we understand women leaders through the lens of reading about male leadership? How do we find Indigenous women's leadership by reading about pale, stale males?
We don't.
No, we don't. And that's why 7th generation thinking, right? Like we need to have that now to inform
make some changes
generations from now.
Yeah. So kind of going a little bit more generally, and I know that you talked about someone that you look up to, Lori Campbell, but can you share some examples from your own life of how Indigenous women incorporate cultural practices into their leadership styles?
Oh, I know so many Indigenous women leaders and within my circle and within universities, and even when I think about our ceremonial lodges and some of the different lodges that I belong to, many of the women Indigenous peers there are in leadership positions at universities, which I also just kind of found like just sort of fascinating, because it just kind of like happenstancely one day I was just sitting there and I was like, oh wow, like you work at this university, you work at this university, you work at this university, and so I guess one of the things that I would say that is common amongst us all is that we do very heavily live our culture, and we don't set it aside when we walked into the doors of institutions. And it's that part of who we are that I suspect for most gives us strength to do what it is that we do, because it's difficult. There's absolutely beauty and joy, and we're passionate about our work. I know we are, but it's not always easy. And so having that, I think, helps us to, do what we need to do. And, and one thing, my auntie said to me before I came back home for the position that I'm in here at the University of Regina, and she said, I was out at the University of Waterloo, and I said, I'm coming home. And she's like, great. And she said, you need to go to fast again this year. And I was like, oh, like fasting ceremony, right? It's like on the land, 4 days without food and water. It's usually in July. And it's really, really hot.
Spicy.
Yes. And I'm like, why? Why do I need to do that? It's so hard. And one of the things she said is coming into this leadership position, you're the first one through the door. You're the first one at that table that I get to now sit at, and it will be difficult. And sometimes some people at that table who aren't like you feel like making it to the table is sort of the win, the end result, right? And you can't get sucked into that. You're going to be tired. You're going to sometimes feel like you're fighting an uphill battle. You're going to want to just fit in sometimes and just like say, okay, even when you don't agree with it, just to, not be a bit of an outsider. And she said, you need to have that mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical strength in order to not do that in those spaces, right? And so you need to draw on that. And so that's what our ceremonies, help to teach us. And she said, if I don't, and I, just sort of flippantly say like, okay, I've made it to the table now, we're all good, I don't really have to do anymore. It harms those that would come after me. It would harm the next Indigenous person who comes in. I would do a disservice to them trying to come through that door and what my colleagues' expectations might be of them. But it would also ultimately harm our students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, and the community and surrounding community. And so when I'm tired and feeling like it's an uphill battle, those are the things that I think about and kind of remove myself from the situation and think about, again, those generations that are coming, or, the students that are going through the halls and so excited and just trying to do my best.
You just said so many things that it's like blowing my mind. I have so many questions as follow up. But I think like everything that you just said is it's leading from wherever you are is so hard. And we often hear about the you just need to get to the table and make a spot for you at the table, the quote unquote metaphorical table. But what are you going to do with that power once you are there? And how are you going to continue to move the dial forward? And how are you going to continue to make change? And exactly what you just said about what about the students? You're doing a disservice to the students. You're there to set the stage for how folks can decolonize themselves and how we can decolonize this institution that's been set up for hundreds and hundreds of years, not in anyone's real favor except for maybe the white pale stale males. And so to continue that change, because they're going to go out into the world and say, well, our VP of indigenization just sat there and let us do this and this and this. So, it's fine. We can just continue be colonizers. But no, you have to keep fighting and going for it.
Well, that's one of the things is, the whole EDI, DEI, equity, higher things, and what I hope my research will also show is, there's a difference between hiring somebody who's from one of the designated equity groups to, amplify whiteness or amplify, the institution, or to say okay, we've got our quota. What we really need to think about, and that has been a lot of what's happened at times, right? Because if we look at Melinda Smith's The Equity Myth, her research, showed that although, these EDI designs that we had put in place, they didn't actually create the retention and the fulfillment of the EDI hires. And so one of the things that I realize is that we need to be able to come into these spaces bringing our gifts and our unapologetic and digiqueer selves, whatever it is, our unapologetic woman leadership style, instead of just coming in and because it can just be another assimilation tool, right? If they hire me because I'm Indigenous and queer and say we've hired our Indigenous queer person, but now you need to do everything in the same way that we do it, how have we really helped diversity?
Right. No,
it becomes another assimilation tool. And I think that's where you see job dissatisfaction. I really think across the board, that's where a lot of, for anybody who's not, cis het white male, I think if you talk to most people, I think that would be one of the things that they realize is they couldn't be themselves in their workspace. They couldn't bring all of themselves in there in the same way.
Oh, 1,000%.
Yeah. Just the fact that you focus on authenticity and you focus on, the adversity, going through the struggles to be a better leader allows you to speak up and say, actually, no, I'm not just going to follow whatever you want me to follow just to belong. This is, if we're trying to be inclusive, it's about giving me a voice, hearing my voice, and taking some of my recommendations. So you kind of touched on this, or you have touched on this, but if there's anything else you want to add around how the cultural practices of Indigenous females really contributes to their effectiveness as leaders. Is there anything else you want to add there?
I think it makes us strong. Having that attachment to our culture is, I think, what I hear from my Indigenous women colleagues as well is that's what brings our strength to be able to do that. And so it's interesting because part of my job, obviously I do go out to community events, Indigenous specific events, the First Nations University powwow is coming up. I'll go to that. I might go to, I'm on the board of the YWCA. They had a sweat and a naming ceremony. I went to that. Those are things that I engage with culturally and ceremonially, where I'm often there for a purpose of the university, and bringing the Indigenous students and all that, sort of carrying that with me while I'm there and trying to serve and do well there. What I also have in my terms of employment, and I know I was one of the first to actually really get this in writing across my peer group, is I said, of course, I will do all that. But one of the reasons you've hired me is because of not just my academics, and I got a lot of degrees already. So, more than some others, colleagues. And so I bring with me more than my indigeneity, but you do want me to bring my indigeneity with me and my cultural understanding and my lens in which I experience the world. And so in order to do that and to be the best leader that I can, I need to be able to go to my ceremony where it's how I focus to take care of myself and my family and community. And that's not vacation. And that's part of what I do so that my employer gets the best me possible to lead. And so I see that as well, I think, in some of, the other women that are in these leadership positions. And, we talk about it and learn about self-care, sort of those sorts of things. That's my, I can't get a text from the president, or a board member or anybody else or, my executive assistant or anything. It's where I go and completely detached and am focused on charging up again and recharging myself so that I can go back and get through, the next year.
Yeah.
So I think it's a lot of that. So it's not necessarily I'm not there to teach cultural awareness. We've been there, done that. People should have some degree of knowledge. I also understand, we have newcomers or international students. And so there's always spaces and places where that's important, but we need to think of the context of it. When I was hired, I always think the best time to be in an interview process is when you don't actually need a job. I had a good job. And so I ended up in this interview process with the University of Regina. So I thought, I have nothing to lose. I will tell them what I will bring. Right. And if they like it, they like it. And if they don't, then I guess they probably won't choose me, which is fine. And I still have a great job. And so, I really was clear and said, I'm not here to teach cultural awareness. I'm not here to sort of, hug out racism. I'm here to look at systems change. What policies and procedures were created, I don't think to be racist or to particularly exclude people, but they were made without all the voices that needed to be in the room. And so now that we've enacted them, we realize that, oh, wow, this harms a certain demographic of students or colleagues. And once we realize that, then we need to do better. It's not just about knowing about us as Indigenous peoples. We need to understand our relationship to each other. Yeah. Because a lot of that Aboriginal awareness training, as it was called, is really just learning about Indigenous people. But that also makes it for a very power dynamic, right? I want you to know about who you are. How did you come to this land? Yeah. At what generation? Why did you come to this land? Where were the Indigenous people in proximity to where your family settled? And understand and start to realize where things went wrong and we didn't get to learn alongside one another. And then we can learn about each other. Yeah. Not just learn about me. Because that removes all accountability for any sort of ongoing harms that are still being perpetuated. And so those are the things that I kind of think about. And I guess they liked that because there was a lot of people in different panels you go through in an interview process for this. And that's really where I kind of settled. And I feel very fortunate because our leadership team and our board and across the campus, there's just a deep willingness to do something different, to take that next step, we're ready for that next step.
Good.
You know,
Yeah.
that work that, you know, has been done before all of us has been done by, you know, by your moms, by, you know, by my aunties, right? And so now we get to be here. So what are we going to do to take the next best steps so that those that will follow, you know, won't be saying like, well, you knew about all this and how come your generation didn't do a damn thing?
Right.
You know, I don't want to be that person,
no,
you know, whose grandkid comes and says like, you know, like,
I truly don't think you will.
No, I don't think so at all.
I think you set the stage. Yeah. I love that you kind of led the way and created space for including ceremony as part of your job, because obviously you want to come as your whole self to your position and keep doing all those things that you said in the interview process every single day in the university setting. I know in your research or your proposal, I guess you talk a lot about like the way that Western universities are set up. So can you talk a little bit about like the clash between that Western university ideology and then the Indigenous ways of knowing and being?
Yeah, you know, institutions are, I mean, they're colonial institutions and I get that.
Right.
It's not about, you know, some people think like, oh, we want to just like go dismantle the whole institution or bring it down. It's not about that. Obviously there's value in the opportunities that come with, you know, education in the institution. And so it's really some of the clashes, I guess, come with like, whether it's timelines. You know, I mean, just a fact. We know that as an Indigenous person and given all of the symptoms of colonization that were affected by that, an Indigenous student will probably have more deaths in the immediate family or community than a non-Indigenous student will.
Right.
So how is that going to affect their studies? I was at our provincial conference. The ministry had put it on for Indigenous post-secondary institutions. And one of the students, I had the privilege of moderating the student panel, which is always my favorite to do because they bring such blunt, you know, in your face, like this is a reality of it. And one of the students had said like another student, you know, whose mom had died and like they had to be back at school within the week, you know, in order to not fall behind. And how can that be? Like as an employee, you know, like we get more time than that. So how can we expect that of students? And so I think about things like that, or those are some things I see. And then we also have, you know, like myself, I often tell my leadership team, you know, like I'm living my life as an Indigenous queer person. At the same time, I'm trying to lead the university through whatever is happening, right? And of course, we've had lots of the gravesite recoveries. And when that's first started occurring, and then more closely related to us is Maryvale Residential School, which is very close to our community. We have lots of students. Our board chair is from that community. And at the same time that the university, and that hit the news, and the university is saying we need to, you know, make a statement about that, I have like nieces and nephews and other people calling me and like, oh my God, like trying to process it. And I'm trying to process it. And I said at one point to our team at the university, and I've actually said several times, you know, you have to understand that I'm living this as I'm like trying to do my work. And so I might need a moment sometimes. And the media is just going to have to wait, you know, not look for that sort of knee-jerk reaction. And the leadership team has been amazing. You know, I think it was maybe a learning curve for them to actually understand what that means. But I do believe, and that's part of my role at the institution, I want my colleagues to understand more, to take that next step alongside me and to see things, you know, a little bit differently. And so that's another thing I think, you know, that we need to consider as well.
Yeah. In kind of a recent, I can't remember what kind of conversation it was, but in a recent conversation I was having with somebody, that there was this like non-understanding of a student in a high school situation who is Indigenous, who had multiple deaths in the family. And the one person who was speaking was like, I don't understand how this person has this many aunties and uncles and everything else. And the person that was telling me this was like, it's just the culture, and that's just what it is. And like, they're not trying to skip school. I mean, even if they are, that's a different conversation, but you have to come to it with understanding before you come to it with anything else. And
absolutely. And I can, you know, tell you a little bit about, because I grew up with a white family, right? And so I learned the colonial family system. You know, everybody had 2 children, and you know, we went to grandma's for Sunday supper, and you know, your aunties were your mom's sister, and you know, your dad's, and so when I found my birth family, if you want to look at it in one way, Auntie Maria's father is my mom's father's brother. Okay. So when I first met Maria Campbell, I a few times kept saying that I was her cousin. And one time, and then she would kind of look puzzled, and then she'd say Auntie, and I'd be like, okay. And then again one time when I was at her place at Gabriel's Crossing and at her summer house, and somebody was visiting, so like one of her friends, and she says, "This is my niece," and I said, "Cousin," and she said, "Stop thinking with your white mind." She said, "I'm your auntie." She said, like, show me some respect for my age and my learning and the role that I play in your life.
Oh my God, I love that.
It was such a good lesson because I just understood things like so different. And that's probably one of the first statements that really kind of set me on this decolonizing lens. It is so important, I think, to think about like what thoughts are driving our thoughts, whose stories are informing how we're understanding each other today. And it was just a system. It's just a system of, a Euro-Canadian background, a family system that's different than what the Indigenous family system, and it's not better, it's not worse.
Yeah.
And so our relationship to one another is more about the role that we play in each other's lives, and also acknowledging respectfully the age difference.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my family, I have younger cousins by a Euro-Canadian way that call me auntie, like they just know.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I, call them my niece or nephews, or other sometimes students, depending on, how our relationship has been and what role it is, that just kind of progresses along. And I had this little changeover because I used to kind of think when I was working at the University of Waterloo, and I realized students were kind of seeing me in this auntie way. And I was like, I want to be young, cool, and hip again. And but it was a bit of a transition because then I realized that this is just a beautiful thing. Like, what an honor for somebody to view me in that way, because I think of my aunties and how much, I rely on them and how much strength I get from them. And so like your aunties, there's multiple aunties and you're expected, as you would with any auntie, to be there. Like, should something happen, should somebody pass, and you're expected to be there and you should be there. And so that's different. Even with some of our work, right? Like, you only get like a certain number of days if it's a certain person, right? Or an in-law of such. And, how do you navigate that? I think there are, a few differences now within our unions and things. So that would be an example of a policy or a union decision that is just egocentric.
Right.
As far as Euro-Canadian culture.
This literally brings me perfectly to the next question, which is, how do you navigate those conflicts in culture, in them understanding, in, how do you go through your role, especially as in a leadership role, to help others understand?
I'm an educator. The older I get, the more I've just come to accept some things about what I bring and have some trust in that, because to not do that also kind of disregards or disrespects the people who have invested and shared and spent time with me and helped to teach me. And so a lot of times, like if it's really hard, like I remove myself again from it. Even if my voice shakes, I still got to say it because I'm the one who gets to be in that room or at that table. And so literally, like one of the first things I remember when I first joined the university, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be the first Indigenous person at this executive table. I need to set the tone, because if I sit there and if I don't say anything, this is what I'm thinking in my head. This was my self-talk. If I don't say anything, they're going to probably expect my colleagues that I don't say anything all the time. And, so I read through all my notes or all the information and I came up with a couple questions. And then when I got in the room, I made sure to ask my questions, but actually what came out of my mouth, like almost just minutes into the meeting, because I looked around the room, I saw all these pictures of men on the wall, mostly white, couple women. I saw the artwork in the room, and I just kind of out of my mouth kind of said, like, I just got to say, if I look, around the room, like, y'all are white. And so I just want to acknowledge, that I'm coming in here not, with that experience and through that lens. And I see that, like, it's very much, in my space here. And I just want to acknowledge that. And so some of it is just acknowledging, I often ask, is this decision I'm making actually going to further assimilate Indigenous students, or am I, allowing them to be unapologetically Indigenous? And it's not that I'm, that we're not doing sort of assimilation or bicultural learning processes to be involved in things, but I want us to be informed about the decisions we're doing and to be able to understand, like, and I think if we ask ourselves that question, sometimes we can better understand, or we might seek out a different way, but there has to be some uncomfortableness in that, right? And one of the key things I think about being at that executive table and why these positions are so important as well is in the past, the generation before us, they took a lot of positions that were advisors to the president or advisor to an organization. And an advisor is great and important, but do you have any power in the decision making or the resource allocation? And the other thing that happened was like a leadership team would meet, and if they decided, oh, it's an Indigenous issue, they would go to the advisor, and then they may or may not take the advisement. So the person was never involved again, like in the decisions that affect all of the institution. And I hope, having us at those decision-making and resource allocation tables that affect all of the institution, that we're going to cause less harm to Indigenous students, staff, and faculty, because the conversation about the university budget does involve me. And also, again, like my colleagues who, they bring more than their whiteness to the table.
Right.
Yeah, of course.
They have education and special skill set in their area. And, according to my bio, I've had a different path than most going to administration, in that I started in student services and then kind of moved through. But I think that's given me a really amazing foundation, because I also remind our team all the time to remind myself as well that, we only get to be here because students show up.
Yeah.
We get to have these amazing jobs because students show up, and we have a responsibility to that. And it's not just the education, like not just what's learned in the classroom. It's like, are we supporting good citizen development so that they understand each other? We have such a diverse student population. How are we fostering that? Because they're going to be colleagues down the road. They're going to, they're going to be the ones taking care of us when we're old, and all those sorts of things. So I think about that broader responsibility, and it's beautiful, right? It's like, wow, what a privilege.
It is such a privilege. And I think that so often we forget why we're here and what we're doing and who we're doing it for. So great that you're taking it to the table and reminding everybody. Okay, so looking back at your research more specifically, and I know that you're not complete your research yet, but you had mentioned that it does aim to decolonize leadership theory. So what does this mean, and how does it challenge traditional Western frameworks of leadership?
Right. So when I first went to university in the early 90s, I learned about feminism.
Right.
I heard of feminism, and I'm like, oh, what is this? It sounds really cool. And so I tried to learn about it, but I didn't see myself represented in it. I didn't see Indigenous issues represented. In the literature and what I went to I love libraries. Libraries are amazing. And I went and I'd read through stuff, but I never saw me as an Indigenous person, as a queer person in that. And so I kind of just thought feminism wasn't for me. It was just something that belonged to white women, I guess. But I was reading the wrong stuff. Right. I was reading what was there. And so when I look at leadership, most and much of the publications and the theory behind it that has been written has been by those with affluence and resources for multiple generations, which comes from white males and now some, white females. And I was thinking about how, again, Indigenous women were leaders before contact. And so I just started thinking about I don't want to compare it. I don't want it to be a comparison to. It's not.
Right.
It's not a comparison to, and I don't want it to be informed or seen through the lens of white leadership. And so one of the things that was an exercise for myself in doing my literature review, for example, there's so much Indigenous scholarship out there now, which, wasn't on the generation before. I draw very heavily on Dr. Jackie Ottman's work, president of First Nations University, whose work was around Indigenous leadership when she did her Ph.D. And had this conversation with her, but a lot of her literature drew on wasn't Indigenous authored.
Right.
Because it wasn't available at the time. And so I made a conscious effort. So she did that step before me, right? And it gave me something to build on. And so now that there's all this Indigenous literature out there, I wanted to learn about leadership from Indigenous people. Not from white people talking about Indigenous leadership, or not from white theory around leadership, and obviously focusing on women. So I did a calculation, but 85% of the literature I draw on is by Indigenous women, maybe 5% Indigenous men, some of it Black queer women. And there's only one actually white woman that I reference directly. It's not that I don't reference or don't refer to some white theory, but usually when you're doing scholarly writing, you go to the original source. But I didn't want to do that. So if, for example, Jackie Ottman or Kim Anderson or Lynn LaValle or Sheila Kodemi referenced some white theory, I would say, like so-and-so as seen through the lens of Sheila Cody Meeks, because then it's already like the Indigenous interpretation of
Right.
it. But it also leads to who then the genealogy of referencing. If I don't reference all those Indigenous women, the genealogy just doesn't continue on. So now somebody, hopefully the next person who comes along can take mine and see all this Indigenous scholarship and just go back to that, right? So in my work, I try to think about not comparing at all.
Right.
So I try to erase, like my auntie says, stop thinking with your white mind and just understanding Indigenous women's leadership, because it's a thing. I don't quite know what it is, but it's a thing. It's been there forever. And I just want to look at the beauty of that and how we're doing that, how we're walking forward with that within us.
Beautiful.
I just love it.
And so strategic and well thought. Like when you're thinking about writing, it's not just let me just write and just collect all these things. Who am I collecting from? What is that going to say to the next person who reads this, and so on? Like it all plays such a connected role. So it's super cool.
That's so important in like even first year classes when you talk about changes to be made. I'll say to faculty members, like, look at your syllabus. Like, whose work are you teaching from?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you don't, there's Indigenous brilliance and scholarship in every academic field now.
Yeah.
And so if you're not including that, you're doing two things, especially in that first year class. You're teaching white students that there's no Indigenous brilliance and nothing to offer in this area. And you're teaching Indigenous students that there's no Indigenous brilliance in this area. And therefore, maybe you don't fit into that. And I think those are ways in which we push students out of school. Same with like women in particular, right? If you're not reading any research, scholarly research in engineering by women, you're probably thinking that, well, like, I don't know, do I have anything to contribute in this area? Why am I special? Like what, no other women are here. And so we have impact in like so many unintentional ways, but we need to think about these things.
Yeah. It gives me like goosebumps all over, because I think that we're now at a place, and I think our world and our society, where we can start actually thinking like that and start making then progress for the future. I mean, I know there's still so much work to be done in terms of remedying what's being done, but like we can actually start making waves in terms of those 7 generations.
Well, and challenging the stereotypes right there that exist. So you mentioned earlier how you want to show up as your full self, and that's spiritual, that's mental, that's physical in all your ways, and you take a lot of time and care to make sure you're always showing up in all of those areas. And you also mentioned how Indigenous women are often centered as the grassroots leaders, not the political leaders. So being that Indigenous women leaders are very involved in their communities from many levels, what are some of the challenges that they're facing in their communities, whether it's environmental or economic or health? What are some of those inequalities that they're focusing on?
All of the above.
All of them.
I think one of the things that is somewhat different is like, I don't go to the university and perform my indigeneity, my culture, my everything to do my leadership, right?
Yeah.
What I've been hired to bring is what I bring outside of the institution as well. And so sometimes that can be difficult. It may look like we're having a lot more tea and bannock, in the community when people think maybe we should be in a suit and in the boardroom, but we have to be within those community events. If I like leave community behind and just go work in the institution, then I don't have anything that I brought with me. When I went to the University of Waterloo, one of the things I had said to them when they hired me is, first of all, I was way outside my territory because I was in, Haudenosaunee territory, Mohawk Six Nations, Anishinaabe. And I said, this isn't where I go for my ceremony. Like, I need to stay connected to where I'm from. And so I need to be able to go back home at least once a year for ceremony to bring that with me. And so I think that one of the challenges is at the same time the institution is asking for things, we also have community asking, for me to be at ceremony. I'm going to fast this year. I'm also going to Sundance. I don't have leave for 2 weeks, so I will have to take some of it as vacation. This will probably be the only year I have to do both, but I need to do both. As soon as I got home, I got called by some elders that I've known forever, Two-Spirit elders who said, we've got this land, we're starting a Two-Spirit lodge, we need you to come. And I'm that in-between age. I'm not them, but I'm not. I started to realize that, when you're younger, you go to things and you're like, oh, wow, so cool, and you're just there learning, you're just thinking about yourself.
Yeah.
And I started to realize that it's like, I don't have that luxury anymore. It's like there's a responsibility. Like I hear the urgency from the elders and, many of them, the ones that I work with in particular, like, are you listening? You need to know this. I'm not going to be here forever. And so there's this responsibility. And so I need to be there. And my partner is non-Indigenous, but she has a really good understanding of what that means. But not everybody will have that if they have a non-Indigenous partner. And so that can also be really difficult. But yeah, so sometimes I'm at work. Sometimes, I have to go out into community for a ceremony and I need to be able to be there to do that. I'm not valuing being at the boardroom table. Yeah. It's that it shouldn't be this is a higher value than this. I'm on the blanket with the pipe at the table.
Yeah. That's the table.
That's the table I need to be at. And so that can be difficult. Sometimes it can be tiring because you're at both kinds of things. In the institution, like when they host their kind of events and community events, you should be at like their evenings, their galas, their things like that, and dinners, and then it's like sunrise ceremonies, and you just have less hours in your day. But it's important to maintain that connection. It's important to me, but it's also important for community to see that, because again, if I were to cut that off, it should be time to leave my position because somebody else needs to be there, right? Yeah. If I'm not there for those right reasons. My auntie also told me once, I said, I had to do a keynote last week and I was worried before, I don't know, I just get a little nervous before going up, and it's like, I don't know if I have the right things to say or whatever. And I was sitting beside the University of Lethbridge president and I said, my auntie always told me that, she's 84, 85 and speaks all over the world. And so she still gets nervous when she has to speak. And she told me, she said, if you're not just a little bit nervous, it's probably time to sit down and shut up. And it's like, that's like good advice, right? If I'm just so, things are flying out of my mouth and without me thinking or being concerned about what I'm saying, then it's probably time to let somebody else speak. Yeah.
Well, let's sit down and shut up. Yeah. That's so funny. No, I really appreciate that. I think that that's such an important way of being self-reflective also, and understanding how you're navigating this and how people perceive you, and that talking about that responsibility that you have. I think even now, like as for Skylar and I mean, we are still in our careers and still figuring ourselves out and all that sort of thing. But when people look to us and say, I look to you for this thing, and it's like, oh God, really? I don't even know. I don't think I know what I'm doing, because that imposter syndrome comes in and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So in closing, you've given us so much insight today. So thank you so much. But we want to know, and we always kind of end with this type of question, what are some of the things that institutions or individuals can do to better support and empower Indigenous women leaders in academia and beyond?
In a lot of ways, I would say is learn, educate yourself, and be humble. So many times, because so many of our organizations things have just been done that way, for so long. And that's where I think we need to think about, well, why are they always done that way? Why am I expecting, a person to behave this way or to make their Gantt chart in a certain way, or, to present or whatever, and be open, especially in education, to learning. I mean, that's what we do, right? And so be open to learning ways that are different than what we're familiar with before you open your mouth.
Yes.
Think about that.
Think about it. Be open. Yes.
Be curious. You had said that multiple times. Be curious. And that's, I think, the best way to live your life is come to it with curiosity.
Absolutely.
Lori, do you have anything that you'd like to close with, to share kind of some final tidbits of advice? Or
I guess one thing I would say, well, two things. One is, it's not easy. It's not easy for any of us. And I wouldn't want to mislead people to think that, my life is Instagram, what you see on my Instagram. And I'm not trying to take any pity or anything like that, but I do get doubts and I do struggle, and I do text my auntie and other women and colleagues, and I have a lot of support around me. I think it's really important to have sort of I call them my ride or die crew. I don't always need that person who's just like, I need that person who's going to be honest with me and in a respectful, loving, kind way, and say, Lori, that decision you made, I don't know if that was a good one. Right. Can we talk about that? I don't need my ride or die crew is going to say, oh yeah, everything you do is great. Everything you do is great, because none of us are immune to, our egos sort of getting in. So I think having good people around you is really important, and know that some days are going to be better than others. And I just always try to think that, as long as I bring the best that I got on today, that's all I can do. And one other thing is I appreciate, the work that you guys do. And I think that's important in that leadership, because the audience and participation of the folks that often, might be listening to this might be different than a different group that I'm in. And so you're using your power and privilege and opportunities here to try to reach out to others who will be listening to this. And that's important, right? And so I appreciate that. Appreciate the opportunity to bring whatever things I might be bringing to, those that will be listening to and hearing this. So thank you for that.
Oh, we appreciate you and all of your wisdom and insight. So thank you so much, and your time. So
yes, of course.
Thank you so much.
And we will be hearing from Lori again in the near future. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, Lori.
Right. Thank you. Let's go with the Noel.
So as we heard from Lori,
I love her.
the ever wise, ever inspiring, I just love listening to her voice too. It's just so calming. Matriarchal leader of ours. Matriarchs are really the cornerstone of Indigenous resilience and cultural revitalization in Canada.
Yeah.
By honoring and amplifying their voices, we really can contribute to the advancement of reconciliation efforts and the promotion of gender equality within Indigenous communities. So let us strive to uplift the matriarchs as they continue to embody the strength, the wisdom, and the spirit of Indigenous peoples across the nation. So if you're interested in learning more, we've linked a bunch of resources on strength and resilience, specifically Indigenous strength and resilience, in the show notes. So please check them out.
Thank you for joining us today. This was a really good one. This one felt nice.
Yeah.
But not as terrifying. We didn't confront the scaries too much, but very real life stories that are impacting women and girls. Please share this episode, rate and subscribe wherever you are listening, and stay tuned for more ways to make a positive impact. Together, we can make the world a little less scary for women and girls.
Follow us on Instagram at RaiseHerCo and scaries.podcast, and on TikTok at RaiseHerCo. And remember that change starts with awareness and action and advocacy and recognition. So that's what we're doing here today. And thank you so much for being a part of our community and making the world a little less scary to exist as a woman.
Bye.